He said it. I know that's not what everyone says.
Anyway, I'll have to think about that one.
It's like
For
Hosea.
I guarantee you nobody here knew him.
you. Yeah, he probably, he was from Middle East, and he spoke a dead language, so he probably said it a lot differently than we did, also. So
My Bible has it spelled Habakkua.
for pronunciation purposes, or actually spelled.
That's what I think it is, because it's italicized.
Yeah. So how was Bible class tonight? We don't know. We're still trying to figure out how to pronounce his name. Anyway, we'll go with it. How about we not mock anybody for the way they pronounce it? We'll just go on with Bible class. Anyway, Nahum would have known how to pronounce it, I'm sure. Anyway. Now, that's funny that we bring that up, because what's most of the Old Testament written in? What language? Hebrew, right? Aramaic, some of it. Okay, so we've got that. So we're kind of jumping ahead. If you jump ahead to A3, the name Habakkuk is not a Hebrew name. And so there's some discrepancy when you read different things. If you look at your Barnes chart on the back, it tells you as far as the meaning, which is going to be similar to your, the Barnes charts always come after this was written. So anyway, as far as for my study. Anyway, meaning one who embraces, but the thing is there's some people that believe it could mean something different, like the name of a garden plant. But anyway, the name Habakkuk, as far as to embrace, something along those, would fit with the authorship of the book. And we understand that God used these individuals directly, but we understand that God also works providentially. And so it's interesting how some of the names align with what their purpose was. Okay? And so as you think about that, we're not really talking about the outline so much, but the theme of the book, one of the questions, we go to Habakkuk chapter 1, look at verse 2, the question. It says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear, even cry out to you violence, and you will not save?" And so really the question Habakkuk is asking in this book is, he says, how long, how long? Okay. Because Habakkuk, if you look at the date, I know we're jumping around a whole lot. On your Barnes charts, he puts the date probably around 607, which lines up with my study that I put together here. And so most likely the date of the book was around the middle of the 7th century BC, around 650, maybe as late as 600. We understand things count down. And some put this as, if you look, I think this was on Barnes charts, that it was within a year. Where's that at? Maybe it's something else. Anyway, a lot of the prophets were writing about situations that they never were going to see directly, right? As far as the doom that was going to come through the Babylonian captivity. Habakkuk's probably different. He probably got to see, if he lived in that time period, which is interesting because his question is, how long, how long? Because we've got prophets that have been prophesying about this for hundreds of years, and some of them we looked at, through our study of the minor prophets. And so him being a man of God and a prophet, being familiar with the prophecies that were happening or had happened long before his birth. And he sees the wickedness of the nation. We're a long ways from our direct outline, but this is really talking about the book. Is he said he sees what the prophets were talking about. And it's very vivid to him. And I think the same statement's in the book of Revelation, right? How long? Okay. But theirs was, how long are they going to endure what they're enduring? And he said, how much time do we have until we start to endure the things we're going to endure? And so it's interesting. And so, Habakkuk is one that realized that God was very, very patient with his people. And that's important, because I think some of the other prophets maybe they were more ready. Things were just far more distant, right? And this prophet, he saw the gross immorality of the nation. Anyway, let's get back. We'll try to roll through this because I really do want to look at a lot of the book this evening if we can. It's just a short book. A2, we're talking about authorship. We know very little concerning the prophet, except we know some about his character, that he was a prophet of God. Habakkuk 1 says the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, right? And so he's named here. Read chapter 3 and verse 1. It says a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet. On. Does anybody want to pronounce that one? Anyway, we'll move on. Habakkuk 2:1. Habakkuk, we see him being described as being a watchman, right? He says, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. And so, what's a rampart?
Like a wall.
Okay, wall. Sometimes it's translated as a high tower, right? It was a vantage point to watch from. And so Habakkuk saying, I'm a watchman for the nation of Israel. What's he watching for?
God,
Okay,
do something.
okay. Watching for God to do something. And that's interesting. And we'll talk some more about that here in a few minutes as we think about this. Habakkuk 2 and verse 2 said, the Lord answered me and said. And I think this is great for our study. He says, write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he may run who reads it. Okay? We'll come back to verse 2 here in a minute as we think about this. But we're talking about the authorship. We know this book was inspired. Habakkuk said, this is a message from God. I was commanded to write it. So the prophet spoke to the people on behalf of who? God. And so we also see that Habakkuk spoke to God on behalf of who? People. Right? How do we speak to God today?
Prayer.
Through prayer, right? There are any examples of someone talking to God on behalf of others?
Moses.
Moses. I didn't think about Moses. Here's what I was thinking about. Simon the sorcerer, what did he ask? Did he ask for prayers? Did he say, pray for me? I thought about that. And I also thought about James chapter 5. You know, where they're going to, the prayer of faith, as far as, you know, they're going to pray for the sick, things like that. So that's something. So we have here, he's praying for the people, on behalf of the people. What a great thing. Let's look at Habakkuk 1 verse 12. 1:12, he says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have appointed them for judgment, O rock, and have marked them for correction. And so if you look at the first chapter, I know we're not to the outline yet, but what we have is really two questions that Habakkuk is asking, and God answers the questions. And so we'll get to those here in a little bit, but this is great. I love Habakkuk the way it's laid out because we see that. Some of the prophets we understand when they speak, we don't necessarily see God's answer. When you read the book of Job, does God answer? Later, much, much later, not when they were ready for it. And so I think it's great that we see this. And the confidence, we understand that Habakkuk was sincere about the situation. We see that point B under introduction to the book of what it's about, and we won't read this. We'll come back to this here in a few minutes. But Habakkuk was concerned about the moral condition of society in which he lived. And he asked the question, how long, right? And I think sometimes we ask that question with America. We say, how long, right? Will God tolerate this? We don't know, right? But Habakkuk was looking for answers. The data book we talked about, the outline of the book, chapters 1 and 2, we see the prophet's questions and answers. Ladder 2, the punishment, and then the prayer of the prophet. Some Bibles will have a designation there and put a split there for the prayer, and then the song of the prophet. What lessons do we learn from the book? First lesson, the nation was not in a state to have their prayers heard. Habakkuk 1 verse 2, he says, "O Lord, we read this, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear, even cry out to you violence, and you will not save." And we understand they were not in a good situation as a nation. And so 1 Peter 3 and verse 12, is everybody familiar with that? We'll go ahead and read it. 1 Peter 3 and verse 12. It says, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." And so when you think about that, we understand Habakkuk's situation. He was able to pray for people who couldn't pray for themselves. Do we ever do that? Yeah, we do that. I think every week, when this congregation meets, we try to do that, and that's a great thing that we are able to do, have the privilege to do. Another thing, point B, it says we must learn to cast all of our cares on God, just as a prophet did. And so we want to read Habakkuk 3, verse 19. "The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer feet, and he will make me walk on the high hills." And so hopefully we're going to go through the book, not the entire book, but most of it in rapid succession here in just a few minutes. And what we'll see is the idea of if the people would read what Habakkuk wrote, they would know to get out of town, and literally to run. Because what was going to happen to what was left of Israel? Destruction, right? And so what they needed to do was they needed to leave. If they would have read the prophet, they would have run, or known to run. Jeremiah 10:23. "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, it's not in man that walketh to direct his own steps." We're probably familiar with that. Go to Isaiah 55 and verse 8. God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways," says the Lord. If we have time, we'll discuss this a little bit more as we go through. Deuteronomy 29:29. Someone wants to go there and read it for us here in just a moment. 55 and verse 8. One of the things that we're going to try to look at here in just a minute is the question that Habakkuk asked. He asked God, why are you going to allow this to happen? Right? Do people ask that question today? Okay. Habakkuk knew that Israel was going to fall, because God had prophets write about it and tell about it for years and years and years. The warning was there. Habakkuk saw the writing on the wall when he looked at the nation, and he realized their gross immorality. But one of the things he also realized was that a heathen nation was going to come in, and they're going to do terrible things through the process of war, right? And so he asked, why would this be allowed to happen? And so I think that we'll look at this. God answers that question. Deuteronomy 29:29. Somebody have that?
"The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law."
Okay. And so the reason we've had this verse here in our study tonight is because Habakkuk had questions, and so I believe God answered Habakkuk's questions. Just because we have questions answered, does that mean we always understand? No, right? And so we would put Deuteronomy 29:29. Some things we just won't understand, but things that we won't understand or cannot understand, we'll put it that way, it's okay, right? And maybe that's where we're at in our spiritual journey, as far as we're not mature enough to understand those things, or we're not at that point yet. But there's also some things that we're just not going to be revealed, or will be revealed to us.
Some of it just may be answered, we just don't realize it.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Maybe we're too blind to see it,
We just don't know.
or we don't like the answer. Yeah, that happens. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. "Cast all your care upon him, for he cares to you." Job, much like Habakkuk, when he was going through a difficult situation, where did he turn?
God.
To God, right? Even though Job didn't understand, he turned to God. That's an important principle here. Galatians 6 and verse 7, we have this, and so this is in the book. We're going to encompass this thought. Is from the book we see that evil will not go unpunished, right? And go back to, is God's time always my time? Does somebody have Galatians 6, 7? If so, shout it out.
Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap.
That's right. Yeah. Is that a promise? Yeah, it is. And so righteousness will be rewarded, and unrighteousness will also be rewarded. God rules the earth. We won't go here, Daniel 4 and verse 17, but we see that. And this is another place where it's stated. And then another lesson from the book we might take, and there's other lessons you might find as you study through for yourself. He says we need to be a watchtower, and that's a verse we read here a few minutes ago. And what's it mean to be a watchtower?
Persistence.
Okay, persistent. I was thinking about in the verses here, 1 Peter 5, be sober, be vigilant because your adversary, right? The nation that was going to come in and conquer, it wasn't a civil war, right? I mean, it was. But what I mean by that, this was because of immorality, right? It wasn't about finances or land. I mean, that's why the other army would come in and conquer. But the root of the matter always goes back to what? Sin, right? Immorality. And so Habakkuk, being a watchtower, we're going to go back there. We're going to start doing a quick overview. We've got about 15 minutes. I think we can. And so he knew, because he knew God, knew prior prophecies, then he knew the prophecies that were now being given to him. He knew how to be prepared, right? He was prepared. And so when we think about that, he was also trying to prepare who? Since he was prepared. Trying to prepare other people. And to the best of his ability. Okay, any questions or comments about what we've gone over?
So all these prophets that we've studied so far have one thing in common, the destruction of Judah?
No, close. Jonah was about Nineveh. Yeah, but up till, that's what it was about. Judah or Israel as a whole.
Talked about it with Nahum and
Yeah.
Habakkuk too, didn't we?
Yeah. And one neat thing about going through this is we see, if I mentioned this last week, tell me to be quiet, is we see, I think we did, the character of each prophet shine through. But the message is always the same. And that's important because the same is true today, right? I'm teaching class. I may be your least favorite teacher, right? But I'll try, right? And all of us have some people we listen to better than others, don't we? And so you have all these prophets with all their different backgrounds. I think, surely this is a conversation we had here, not somewhere else, about John the Baptizer, right? How he dressed and the way he was, right? Would that be appropriate for everyone? You think he would have maybe, for example, would he be able to speak to Caesar the same way that Paul probably would be able to based upon his education and background?
But did these prophets all live at the same time?
No.
No.
So you've got repetitive messages. And so you think about, and we don't know as far as, I think about this in my mind. You say, I didn't think it was that good of a thought. But anyway, we say, when a prophet died, some people would mourn the prophet's death. And some people would be excited about his death, right? And so we think about the timeline of this prophecy that come out. God told his people when they left Egypt that they need to obey me or else you're going to face oppression. We see the cycle of the judges. So we see it's a continual thing. But at some point God says, okay, you're going to eventually get so far from me that I'm going to have to end the nation. So, in my mind, I can imagine this nation say, good, such and such prophet finally died. We don't have to listen to him or his message or feel uncomfortable anymore, right? And I think about Mordecai in Esther, right? He made, we understand, Eric did that study. He was a good guy, right? Did good things in a meek way. Was he liked? No, right? And so, not that Mordecai was one of the prophets, but these prophets, one would die and people say, oh, finally, we don't have to listen to him again. And then guess what? Someone pop up, come out of the woodwork that God has sent as a prophet because of their faithfulness, and say, great, we've got another one, and he's got the same message. Now, when we get in, when we go through and try to read this, what we'll see is, we'll see that if the people paid attention to the message, they were most likely going to be okay, right? I think Daniel would be a good example when we think about that. Do you think Daniel chose the life that he had? Why not?
He got a captive.
He was a captive, right? Where did he live? Under the king's care, right? At least at the beginning, when he was being trained and educated, he was able to eat. Was he able to eat what he wanted? I agree with Debbie. But we got to think about one exception as far as he got to eat what he wanted, but he had to stand for what he believed in, and he was blessed because of it, right? And so just because Daniel didn't choose his lifestyle, did he have a good life? In fact, from what I understand from my study of Daniel, he didn't go back to Jerusalem, right? He was not born and raised, but he stayed, right? Stayed behind. He was comfortable there. He was an old man, right? And it was okay. And so he didn't choose his life, but God made sure he was okay. I visited with a fellow the other day, and he told me that he had a job interview, and they asked him, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I said, I don't know. And they were taken back because he was applying. He's a professional, educated individual. But he says, I don't know because I don't know where the Lord will need me in 5 years. You think about that. Same thing, Daniel surely wasn't where he planned on being when he was taken, around 15 years old from Jerusalem, where he saw his life going. But God made sure he was okay with it. Anyway, we're a long ways. We got to get through this. All right, good comments. I appreciate that. Go back. We'll start in chapter 1, and we saw verse 2, the question, how long? How long shall I cry? Even you shall not hear, even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plunder and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds. What's Habakkuk saying about the social conditions of it? Yeah, corruption, gross corruption, and people who, and we talked about this a little bit in Nahum, I believe, and some of the other prophets would mention, if you stay through, there was no justice, right? And the good weren't being protected or being taken care of. And so his question is, how long can we go on like this? Okay. Who was suffering? The righteous. They couldn't just go along with their lives and be left alone because of these injustices. So, verse 5, we see a reply. Look among the nations and watch. And so we talked about this in chapter 2. What did Habakkuk say he was going to be? A watchtower, right? A watchman. He said, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most of the prophets saw the direction Israel was headed in, but they weren't going to see the end, right? They just prophesied about the end. And I don't know, but I wonder this about the prophets. How many prophets said, I don't want to live for things to get that bad, right? I don't know. But here, Habakkuk, he's at a point, I believe, where he says, things are so bad, I would like to see the end of it, right? The children of Israel, when they left Egypt, why did they leave Egypt? Why were they okay with leaving Egypt? Yeah, because things were so bad, right? Once they got to the wilderness, what do they want to do? They forgot how bad things were, right? And so freedom took some hard work and dedication on their part. It was a faith-building exercise. God, and who did they set themselves up? God set their children up, right? Because they would not allow themselves to take part in the blessings of the new land, right? So God set their children up for success. So, he says, verse 6, for indeed I am rising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breast of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. And they scoff at kings and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses. He commits offenses, ascribing this power to his God. And so what do we know? We know the nation is going to take them over. We know that it's going to be terrible, and we know that they're going to attribute it to who? The victory. So, the prophet has a second question. Verse 12. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment, O Rock. You have marked them for corruption. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil. You cannot look on wickedness. So here, look at the middle of verse 13 where we're at. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? What was Habakkuk struggling comprehending?
Sounds to me like they're destroying everybody,
Okay.
even the good guys.
He says, Habakkuk says, why would you allow a nation as bad as they are to destroy a nation that's maybe not as bad as they are? Did I misread that? Right? And so,
It's like he's upset because they're not being punished.
yeah.
You know, like,
And they will be. We know they will be. We look back at history, they will be. But he said, but he wonders,
judgment now.
how could the providence of God use these terrible people to do terrible things to his people? Right? God allows things to happen, doesn't he? And I'll tell you, I don't 100% always comprehend. I have the same question sometimes, right? We ask the question, and really I think this is what the prophet is asking. He says, how can bad things happen to good people? which I think, when you look at it, you go back and you think about the question, how long? Habakkuk knew what was coming. But then when you really think about it, he said, boy, this is going to be a terrible thing, right? And I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I'm sure you have. But you think about people's eternal destiny, right? And there's sometimes people we really don't like that much. But when you really study about what their eternal destiny would be, or is for the unrighteous, how many of us really want to see that happen? And I think that's one of those things Habakkuk is struggling with. He knows that he's living in a terrible, evil nation that's far away from God. But he also asked the question, he said, God, how could you use this nation as a tool for your righteousness? Keep on reading here. Verse 14. Why do you make them like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook, they catch them in their net, and they gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their snare is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? And that's really the end of 17 is the key that we're talking about. Is God, how can you allow them to do what they do? A difficult question, isn't it? So,
Maybe it's something we don't understand either. That's something else to look at there is,
yeah.
you know, God, how much did God put up with to be able to use something that bad to take out something too?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he's just fed up with it. It's like, they're done.
Yeah.
And this is the tool.
And eventually the same thing happens to the Chaldeans in turn, but he's still questioning how could you use them to do it. Yeah, he waited in the flood, right? And so we could compare this to the flood, couldn't we? But the difference is water is amoral. What's that mean? It's an inanimate object, right? It's not doing right or wrong. It has no desire, right? No fulfillment. God used natural forces, right? And I believe that the Chaldeans were a natural force. It goes back to the book of Job. We won't go there. We don't have time to get to this. We only got 2 minutes. We don't have time for anything. Job, Satan went to God, right? Did God give him permission? Okay. The first time around, what it was taken? Okay. Who took it? This is a trick question, Barb. Who took it? Okay. God, not God. We'll say that. Not God. Who wants to answer this? Who took it? He didn't take it. The Sabaeans and I can't remember the other tribes. They took it. Satan didn't take it. Right? Who took it? What's that? The world. But they couldn't have taken it unless God allowed it. And who did God allow to take it? Anyway, what we know is God's providence. We can't understand how God's promise works. And that's one of the things that Habakkuk was struggling with is he says, how can you allow this to happen? You're using a wicked nation to punish your people, even though they are wicked, but they're not as wicked. So I guess the thing is we don't understand how everything works, but we know that God allowed Job to be tested, tempted, but we don't see that Satan was directly involved, but we know he was involved. How? I don't know. Don't know. But here's the thing. Those tribes that took everything from Job, do you think Satan caused them to do something against their own will? They were that type of people anyway. Just somehow through the happenings of things beyond our understanding, is Job was their target because God allowed Satan to let them. I don't know how to explain that, right? Complicated. So, we're out of time. We see in chapter 2, verse 1, he said, "Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it." What's that mean?
Okay, they're capable of reading it, and if they read it and understand it, they're gone.
Right? Yeah. He says, this is your warning sign. Everyone who is faithful to the prophets, there's Matthew 24 is writing about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? At that time in history, what you have is you have great persecution that was upon the church. You have people like Paul, right? And we understand that God was going to destroy Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. AD 70 is a doctrine. Don't get caught up in that doctrine. But Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. History, this isn't book, chapter, and verse, but history says that the blood ran down the streets. There was so much bloodshed in the city. But secular history also says that zero Christians died in Jerusalem during that. Why? How could that be possible? If you're familiar with Matthew chapter 24, what was Matthew chapter 24? It was a warning. It was a message telling the Christians, this is what's going to happen, watch for the signs. Not for the second coming of Christ, but for the coming destruction of Jerusalem. So they left. And I believe what we see here is, in Habakkuk, it says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. Right? We understand that there's a remnant that was preserved, right? Okay. Wish we could go